10 minutes before 6 on the morning of Thursday, May 21st, 2026, the ground beneath one of the most beautiful cities in Europe moved. A magnitude 4.4 earthquake had just struck Campi Flegrei, the vast hidden caldera that the western edge of Naples is not built near, but built inside. Depth 3.1 kilometres, roughly 1.9 miles below the surface. By the cold standards of seismology, a moderate event. It collapsed no apartment block, it triggered no landslide, it killed no one, and yet within hours mayors were closing schools. Structural engineers were on the record using language that sounded less like engineering and more like a casualty forecast. And people who have lived their entire lives on top of this volcano, people who know the daily rattle, who have felt hundreds of smaller tremors and gone back to sleep, were describing themselves, in their own words, as absolutely terrified. More than 1 million people were woken by that earthquake. 6 million live in the wider metropolitan area it shook. The ground at the centre of the caldera has already risen by 148 centimetres, nearly 5 feet, driven upward by a process called bradyseism that has been running for years and is still running now. That is the number that matters, not the 4.4, the 5 feet. From outside, the reaction looked like panic, like overreaction, like a city that had lost its nerve over a moderate tremor that hurt nobody. It was not panic. It was the correct reading of a situation that a single number, a magnitude, a measurement, a cold seismological statistic cannot begin to describe. The 4.4 was not the story. The 4.4 was the first domino in a chain that runs from the seafloor of the Gulf of Pozzuoli all the way to the evacuation roads that are not ready, the buildings that will not stand, and a historical memory that goes back 5 centuries and has never once let this place forget what it is sitting on. If you are new here, this is Project Night Watch. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the debrief, and drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and tell me, did you feel it? Now, let us go underground. Campi Flegrei did not produce this earthquake from where it was supposed to. That is the thread this entire video follows, not the magnitude, not the depth, the location. Because the location is the thing that made this event strange before it made it frightening. And understanding why it came from where it did is the key that unlocks everything else. At 5:50 in the morning on Thursday, May 21st, 2026, the Osservatorio Vesuviano, the Naples branch of Italy's Istituto Nazionale di Geofisica e Vulcanologia, the agency whose sole job is to watch this volcano around the clock, recorded a magnitude 4.4 earthquake. Depth 3.1 kilometres below the surface. In miles, that is roughly 1.9. Epicenter, offshore, in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, near the town of Boccoli and the low volcanic hill called Monte Nuovo. Hold those 3 numbers for a moment. Magnitude 4.4. Depth 3.1 kilometres. Offshore. The depth matters immediately, so let us deal with it now. 3.1 kilometres is very shallow. Shallow, in the language of seismology, is not a casual descriptor. It is the difference between an earthquake you read about in the morning and an earthquake you feel in your teeth at the moment it happens. When rock breaks deep underground, 30, 40, 60 kilometres down, the energy it releases has to travel a long way to reach the surface. All that rock in between absorbs it, scatters it, softens it. By the time the waves arrive, they have been worn down. A deep earthquake of moderate magnitude can pass almost unfelt. But when the break happens at 3.1 kilometres, there is almost nothing in between. The energy goes straight up. It arrives at the surface fast, sharp, and close to its full original violence. That is what shallow means. That is why it matters. Now, the epicenter. When Campi Flegrei produces a strong earthquake, something in the magnitude 3 or 4 range, it almost always produces it on land. The seismicity of this caldera clusters in a well-known zone. Under the town of Pozzuoli, around the Solfatara crater with its hissing fumaroles and its sulphur-bleached ground, and across toward a district called Agnano to the east. That on-land core is the beating heart of the system. It is where the ground has been rising fastest. It is where the monitoring network is densest. It is where scientists have the deepest instrumentation and the most detailed picture of what is happening beneath the surface. If you had asked any volcanologist in the weeks before May 21st where the next significant earthquake at Campi Flegrei would come from, the answer would have been, from there, from the on-land core, from the place everyone is watching. The May 21st earthquake did not come from there. It came from the water. The epicenter was located offshore, out in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, the curved bay tucked inside the larger Gulf of Naples, off the coast of Bacoli, near a young volcanic cone called Monte Nuovo that rose out of the ground in a single week in the year 1538. We will come back to Monte Nuovo. But for now, the strongest earthquake this caldera had produced in months broke not under a street, not under a building, not under a piazza full of early morning life. It broke under the sea. That is the anomaly. Hold it. Now let us talk about what it felt like, because the physical experience of the May 21st earthquake is part of the data. The towns closest to the offshore epicenter, Bacoli, Pozzuoli, Quarto, Monte di Procida, got the full shallow energy delivery described above. And the accounts from those towns carry a consistent detail that is worth paying attention to. People did not first feel the shaking. They first heard something. A boom. A roar. A long, low growl that residents described again and again as coming not from outside the building, but from directly beneath it. One person said it was like a giant sneeze. Another said they had not felt anything that intense in years. The sound came first, a deep underground percussion that had no obvious source, that the walls and floors seemed to conduct rather than the air. And then the motion arrived behind it. And the motion did not stop quickly. This is the detail that separates this earthquake from a sharp jolt that ends and lets you exhale. The shaking lasted. People lay in their beds and waited for it to be over, and it kept going. They braced against door frames and counted, and it kept going. The duration, that sustained, refusing to stop quality, is part of why the fear was so immediate and so total. A single, sharp crack, however loud, has a shape. It happens and then it is over, and your nervous system can begin to process it. A shake that goes on and on does not give you that. It keeps the question open. Is this it? Is it getting worse? When does it end? For the people of Bacoli and Pozzuoli and Quarto and Monte di Procida, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning, in the dark in their beds, it did not end quickly. And by the time it did, the offshore epicenter had already done the second thing that made this earthquake unusual. It had made itself felt not just in those towns, but everywhere. The 4.4 was not alone. Shortly after midnight, hours before the main shock, a magnitude 1.3 had already registered on the NGV network. Too small to wake anyone, the kind of tremor that gets logged and forgotten. But it was there. Then at 5:50 a.m, the 4.4. And then, 3 minutes later, a magnitude 1.2. 7 minutes after that, a magnitude 2.1. And between and around those named events, a continuous low murmur of micro-earthquakes, too small to feel, but real, recorded, accumulating. By mid-morning, the Osservatorio Vesuviano had confirmed it directly. A new seismic swarm was in progress. The ground at the caldera was still trembling. This matters more than it sounds like it should, and the reason is psychological as much as physical. A single earthquake, however frightening, has a shape. It happens. It ends. The body understands, on some basic pre-rational level, that it is over. The shaking stops and the question resolves, and you can begin to process what just happened. A swarm has no such shape. A swarm is a sequence, an ongoing thing, the ground returning again and again over hours, and every small tremor after the main shock carries the same question that cannot be answered in the moment. Is this the sequence winding down? Or is this the sequence winding up? The statistical answer, the answer that seismologists will give you, and they are right to give it, is that in the vast majority of cases the largest earthquake in any sequence has already happened. What follows is a decaying tail of aftershocks, each smaller than the one before, the system settling after its release. That is the overwhelmingly likely reading of any earthquake swarm. The 4.4 was almost certainly the main event. But likelihood is not certainty. And in the moment, lying in bed in Pozzuoli at 6 a.m, feeling the building shiver again, and again, you cannot know which story you're in. The 4.4 could be the main event. It could also be a foreshock, a warning crack before something larger. The science cannot tell you which, not in real time, not until it is over. So the people of the Flegrei field spent not 60 seconds but the entire morning inside that uncertainty, feeling the ground speak in diminishing but persistent tremors, unable to reach the clean ending that a single shock would have given them. The volcano did not let them have a clean ending. Now at the hour. Emergency planners who think seriously about earthquake risk think seriously about the time on the clock, not as an abstract variable, as a direct input into casualty estimates. The same earthquake, the same magnitude, the same depth, the same geology, striking at different hours of the day, can produce death tolls that differ by an order of magnitude. The reason is simple and brutal. It is about where the population is when the shaking starts. At 5:50 a.m, the population of Naples and the Flegrei towns is as concentrated and as vulnerable as it gets. People are indoors, they're in bed, they're in the upper floors of old buildings, slow to wake, slow to orient, slow to react. Families are gathered under single roofs. The children are in the building, the elderly are in the building. Everyone is in exactly the position that an earthquake is most dangerous to be in, horizontal, disoriented, inside a structure that is about to be shaken. Compare that to a midday strike. At noon, the population is distributed. People are in offices, in cars, on streets, in shops, spread across the whole city in a way that, counterintuitively, actually reduces the toll of a moderate earthquake. Fewer people in any single building. More people outside, away from falling masonry. The same shake, the same force. But the exposure geometry is entirely different. 5:50 a.m. is close to the worst possible hour. Not the absolute worst. That would be the small hours of the night, when sleep is deepest and reaction time slowest. But close. The May 21st earthquake chose its moment with terrible precision. It arrived when the city was indoors, gathered, horizontal and unready. And while the 4.4 was below the threshold where Naples' buildings fail in large numbers, the hour is part of why the fear was so instant and so total. People did not experience a moderate earthquake at a safe distance. They experienced it in the dark, in their beds, in the exact circumstance their instincts recognize as the most dangerous one. Then they reach for their phones, and for a long, frightening stretch of time the screen showed nothing. The public-facing earthquake databases, the ENGV event list, the USGS real-time feed, were silent, not updated, no event posted. A city of millions, physically shaken awake, refreshing, and finding a blank where the answer should have been. The USGS did eventually publish a preliminary location, but placed it slightly wrong, and sized it at roughly magnitude 4.1 before the number was corrected upward. That is not a failure. That is the ordinary, unglamorous reality of real-time seismology. Raw signals reach the instruments instantly, but converting those signals into a published, verified, located event takes time and human review. The first automatic solution is always rough. It always gets revised. But understanding why the silence happened does not undo what the silence did. We will come back to that silence. For now, hold the anomaly the whole morning pointed back to, the offshore epicenter, the strongest earthquake Campi Flegrei had produced in months, and it came from the water near Boccoli, near Monte Nuovo, from the sector of the caldera that sits under the sea. That was not supposed to happen, and it was not the first time it had. To understand why the offshore epicenter matters, you first have to understand what the expected behaviour looks like. Because Campi Flegrei is not a quiet system. It produces earthquakes constantly. In a single week in late February and early March of this year, the monitoring network logged somewhere around 70 tremors, one after another, a near continuous rattle. Most are tiny. Most never reach the threshold where anyone feels them. They are registered only by instruments, processed, filed, forgotten by everyone except the scientists, whose job is to watch them accumulate. But from time to time, the caldera produces the bigger ones, the magnitude 3s, the magnitude 4s, the events that wake people up, that crack plaster, that send residents into the streets in their nightclothes to stand in the open air and wait to see if another one is coming. And when it produces those events, there is a pattern, a consistent, well-documented, extensively studied pattern. The strong earthquakes at Campi Flegrei come from the land. More specifically, they come from a zone that volcanologists have been watching closely for years, the central part of the caldera, running roughly from beneath the town of Pozzuoli across to the Solfatara crater and on toward an area called Agnano to the east. That on-land core is where the deformation has been measured as greatest. It is where the ground has been rising fastest and where the rock above it has been absorbing the most stress. It is, by every measure available, the engine room of the system, and it is, not coincidentally, where the monitoring infrastructure is densest. Seismometers, GPS stations tracking ground movement to the millimetre, gravimeters, gas sensors, temperature probes. The on-land core is the most thoroughly watched piece of ground in the Italian volcanic system. If something is happening at Campi Flegrei, the instruments on that central zone are designed to catch it first and catch it clearly. This is the mental model that scientists and residents have been working from. A central engine, known location, dense instrumentation, strain building in a place that is understood, visible, and watched. When the strong earthquakes come, as they periodically do, they come from there. That has been the pattern. The May 21st earthquake did not fit the pattern. Magnitude 4.4. The strongest earthquake Campi Flegrei had produced all year, and the epicenter was not under Pozzuoli. It was not near the Solfatara. It was not anywhere in the on-land core that the monitoring network is built around. It was offshore, out in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, in the water near the town of Baccoli and the low volcanic hill called Monte Nuovo. The rock that broke was under the sea. One event in the wrong place might be an outlier. Geology is not neat. Fault systems are complex and irregular. A single anomalous event is a data point, not a revelation. You note it, you file it, and you keep watching. But this was not one event. On the 30th of June 2025, less than a year before the May 21st earthquake, Campi Flegrei produced a magnitude 4.6. That number deserves a moment of context. It was the strongest earthquake at this caldera in roughly 40 years. 40 years! The last time the system had produced anything comparable, the year was 1984. The government was relocating tens of thousands of people out of Pozzuoli, and the crisis had been running for 2 years already. The 4.6 of June 2025 was not a routine event. It cracked walls across the Flegrei towns. It collapsed the rocky ridge of a small islet called Penata. Trenitalia, Italy's national railway operator, issued warnings of delays of up to 2 hours as crews inspected infrastructure along the affected lines. It was by any reasonable measure the defining seismic event of the modern Campi Flegrei crisis. And it was offshore, also in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, also near Baccoli, also from the submarine western flank of the caldera. The same sector, the same general area, the same part of the system that sits under the water rather than under the land. 2 data points, the 2 largest earthquakes of the entire modern crisis, both offshore, both from the same sector. I want to be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. because this channel does not deal in conclusions that outrun the evidence. 2 data points is not a trend. It is not proof that the seismicity has migrated. It is not a confirmed shift in the system's behaviour. It is entirely possible that the next significant earthquake at Campi Flegrei comes from the on-land core, exactly where the model predicts, and that the offshore pattern dissolves back into noise. That is a real possibility, and it needs to be named as one. But 2 data points is absolutely enough to be a question. The question is this: are the 2 largest earthquakes of this crisis a coincidence? 2 separate events that happened by chance to share an unusual location? Or are they the beginning of a pattern? Is the most energetic strain release of this unrest phase quietly shifting away from the central core that everyone is watching and out into the water, into the part of the caldera that is harder to instrument, harder to see, and less completely understood? That question does not have a confirmed answer yet, but it is the question that the May 21st earthquake made impossible to ignore. The question, stated as plainly as possible, is this: the monitoring system at Campi Flegrei, one of the most sophisticated volcano surveillance networks on the planet, is built around a central assumption. That assumption is that the most important activity in the system happens in the on-land core, under Pozzuoli, around the Solfatara, Tordagnano. That is where the instruments are densest. That is where the deformation data is richest. That is where the scientific picture is clearest and most detailed. The entire architecture of the monitoring effort rests on the premise that if something significant is developing at this caldera, the on-land core is where you will see it first. Now look at the 2 largest earthquakes of the modern crisis. June 2025, May 2026, both offshore, both from the submarine western flank, neither from the on-land core. If those 2 events are a coincidence, the premise holds. The model is fine, the monitoring is working as designed, and the anomaly is just noise. But if those 2 events are the beginning of a pattern, if the most energetic strain release of this unrest phase is genuinely migrating away from the central core and out into the water, then the model has a problem. Not a catastrophic problem, not a failure, but a specific uncomfortable gap. The system would be producing its largest events in the sector where the instruments are thinnest, the data is sparsest, and the scientific picture is least complete. A model that can no longer cleanly predict where the biggest earthquakes will come from has lost something real. It has lost some of its power to reassure. This is what made May 21st land differently from a routine strong tremor. It was not just the magnitude, it was the location asking a question the monitoring system cannot yet answer. Now consider what the offshore location did to the shaking itself. When an earthquake breaks on land, in the central caldera, under Pozzuoli or the Solfatara, the energy radiates outward from that point in every direction, like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. The strongest shaking concentrates in a roughly circular zone around the source. People at the centre feel it hard. People further out feel progressively less. The energy has a focus, a clear gradient, a shape that emergency planners and residents alike can orient themselves around. An offshore epicentre changes that geometry entirely. When the source is in the water, the energy spreads across a broad arc of coastline, a sweep of shoreline that in this case includes some of the most densely populated urban ground in Europe. The shaking does not diminish cleanly from a known centre. It arrives across a wide front at roughly similar intensities, across a vast area all at once. That is why the felt reports from May 21st look the way they do. The 4.4 was felt across the full width of the caldera. It was felt through the neighbourhoods around Mount Vesuvius on the far side of the city. It was felt on the island of Ischia. It was felt inland as far as Caserta. 6 million people, distributed across an entire metropolitan region, all shaken at roughly the same moment, and here is the human consequence of that. Most of those 6 million people do not think of themselves as living on a volcano. They live in Naples, in the eastern suburbs, in the hill districts, in areas that are geographically and psychologically distant from the Flegrei fields and their steaming craters and their evacuation zones. They have a mental map of where the danger lives, over there to the west, in Pozzuoli, in the red zone. Not here. That map is not irrational. It is a reasonable way to manage the psychological weight of living in a city that sits between two active volcanic systems. On the morning of May 21st, the shaking reached further than that map allowed for. People in districts that do not consider themselves volcano towns felt their beds move. A man in a cafe kilometres from the caldera watched the liquid in his cup tremble like a jacuzzi and could not immediately explain why. A danger that reaches further than your mental map of it is, almost by definition, a danger you feel you have lost a measure of control over. You can manage a known risk in a known location. You cannot manage a risk whose boundaries you have just discovered are not where you thought they were. That dislocation is part of what made the morning so frightening, and it is directly produced by the offshore location. The offshore location is not just a geographical detail. It changes the felt area, it changes the monitoring picture, and it opens one further pathway. A specific physical consequence of a strong earthquake under the sea rather than under the land, that we will name before this is over. But to understand why that pathway matters, we have to go underground first, into the caldera, into the slow, decade-long process that produced this earthquake and is already producing the next one. There is a word for what Campi Flegrei does. It is one of the stranger words in geology, because it describes the ground itself behaving like something alive. The word is bradyseism. It comes from Greek roots, brades, meaning slow, and seismos, meaning movement or shaking. Slow movement. That is the literal translation. And what it describes is this: the floor of the caldera, the broad collapsed crater that the western neighbourhoods of Naples are not built near but built inside, does not stay still. It rises, it falls. Over years and decades, the entire ground surface inflates and deflates, slowly, continuously, like the chest of an enormous sleeping thing drawing breath and releasing it. That is not a metaphor deployed for dramatic effect. It is the documented, measured, observed behaviour of the land. It has been measured with instruments. It has been recorded in monitoring bulletins. It has been studied in peer-reviewed literature. It is, by every scientific account available, simply what this caldera does. The ground breathes. It has been breathing for as long as anyone has been watching it closely enough to see. Right now, it is breathing in. The Ingevese monitoring network at Campi Flegrei includes a dense array of GPS stations capable of tracking ground position to the millimetre. Those stations log the rise and fall of the caldera surface continuously, in real time, feeding data back to the Osservatorio Vesuviano every hour of every day. And what they have been recording across the span of the current unrest phase is a sustained, ongoing, accelerating inflation. The point on the caldera where the ground has risen the most, the epicenter of the uplift, if you want to think of it that way, is a place called Rione Terra. It is an ancient promontory in the heart of Pozzuoli, a rocky outcrop that has been continuously inhabited since Roman times, that contains the ruins of an entire buried Roman town beneath its modern streets. It is also the part of Campi Flegrei that has risen furthest. The numbers at Rione Terra are worth stating carefully, because they are the kind of numbers that sound large in the abstract and become genuinely staggering when you convert them into something human scale. Total uplift at Rione Terra during the modern crisis, approximately 148 centimetres. In feet, that is nearly 5. In 2024 alone, a single calendar year, the ground there rose by roughly 29.5 centimetres, close to a foot, in 1 year. Stack those figures for a moment: 148 centimetres of total rise, 29.5 centimetres in 2024 alone. Streets, buildings, harbour walls, the piazza where people sit and drink coffee in the evening, all of it lifted slowly and continuously by whatever is happening in the rock below. The ground in the centre of Pozzuoli has risen by close to a human height, This is not ancient history being described from a sediment core or a Roman archaeological record. This is happening now. This is happening this year, under the feet of people going to work, sending their children to school, parking their cars in streets that are measurably higher than they were a decade ago. The breathing is real, it is current, and it has not stopped. Now, what is doing the breathing? This is the central scientific question of the entire Campi Flegrei crisis. Everything else, the earthquakes, the gas emissions, the debate about evacuation, the fear on the morning of May 21st, flows from the answer to this question. So it deserves to be laid out carefully and honestly, because the honest version is more useful than the scary version, and also, as it happens, more interesting. There are, broadly, two things that could be pushing the ground up. The first is magma, molten rock rising from depth, physically inflating the system as it pushes toward the surface. That is the nightmare reading. If magma is ascending, actually moving upward through the crust, intruding into new space closer to the surface, then the ground inflation is a direct consequence of that movement, and magma ascending is the recognized prelude to an eruption. This is the scenario that makes volcanologists watch very carefully, and that makes the word Campi Flegrei produce a particular quality of silence in a room full of earth scientists. The second is hydrothermal. Not magma itself, but the gases and superheated fluids that magma produces as it sits deep below the surface. Magma is hot. Even magma that is not moving, that is parked far below the caldera floor with no intention of going anywhere, is constantly releasing gases. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, steam. Those gases and heated fluids migrate upward through the rock. They pressurize it, they heat it, they expand it, and that expansion pushes the ground up from below, not because molten rock is climbing, but because the invisible gaseous exhaust of magma sitting far below is doing the pushing instead. The two explanations look identical from the surface. In both cases, the ground rises. In both cases, earthquakes follow. In both cases, gas emissions increase and temperatures climb. The difference between them is not visible. It lives in the interpretation of the data, in the specific patterns of seismicity, in the ratios of different gases coming out of the solfatara, in the geometry of the deformation field. And it is the difference between a system that is dangerous and one that is more immediately dangerous. Here is the mainstream scientific assessment of the current Campi Flegrei crisis. It deserves to be stated clearly and prominently, not buried, not softened, not treated as a footnote to the scary parts. The prevailing assessment, supported by detailed studies of this unrest phase and endorsed by the monitoring agencies responsible for watching the system, is that what is currently driving the inflation at Campi Flegrei is dominated by hydrothermal processes, gases and superheated fluids, the exhaust of deep magma migrating upward through the rock, pressurizing it, heating it, pushing the surface up from below, not ascending magma, not molten rock climbing toward the surface. The NGV's current alert level for Campi Flegrei is yellow. On the 4-level scale used by Italy's civil protection system, green, yellow, orange, red. Yellow means attention. It means the system is in a state of unrest that warrants careful monitoring. It does not mean an eruption is considered imminent. It does not mean the agency has evidence of magma ascending toward the surface. No monitoring agency watching this caldera is currently forecasting an imminent eruption. That is the honest, sober, mainstream position, and this channel will not obscure it. Now, what hydrothermal does not mean. People hear the word hydrothermal, and they relax. The instinct is understandable. If the driver is gas and fluid rather than ascending magma, the immediate picture is less alarming. The nightmare scenario, molten rock pushing toward the surface, the classic eruption precursor sequence building toward an event, is not what the data currently shows. That is genuinely meaningful. A system driven by hydrothermal processes is, in the immediate term, less dangerous than a system with ascending magma. The distinction matters and it is real. But hydrothermal does not mean harmless. This is the trap, and it is a trap that the public discourse around Campi Flegrei falls into repeatedly. The word gets used as though it were a synonym for safe, for stable, for resolved. It is none of those things. Hydrothermal means the immediate driver is not ascending magma. It does not mean the magma is gone. The magma is there. It has always been there. Everyone agrees it is there, sitting deep below the caldera. It does not mean the system is incapable of escalating. It does not mean the current unrest will not transition into something more alarming. Volcanic systems are not static. The assessment that unrest is currently hydrothermal is a snapshot, an interpretation of the data as it stands today, not a guarantee about what the data will show next month or next year. The honest scientific position is not hydrothermal, therefore relax. The honest position is, the unrest currently appears hydrothermal, which is somewhat less alarming than the magmatic alternative, and the situation requires constant vigilant monitoring precisely because hydrothermal systems can change, can intensify, and can produce hazards of their own that have nothing to do with magma ascending at all. The monitoring continues because the story is not over. Now, the coupling. ENGV researchers studying the current unrest phase have documented something that turns the abstract relationship between ground inflation and earthquakes into a concrete, quantified, measurable link. The relationship is this: the faster the ground rises, the more earthquakes the caldera produces, and the stronger those earthquakes tend to be. This is not a qualitative observation. It is a measured correlation, established through analysis of the monitoring record across the full span of the current crisis. When the uplift rate at the centre of the caldera increases, seismicity intensifies. When the rate slows, seismicity eases. The two variables move together. The autumn of 2025 provides the clearest recent demonstration. During that period, the uplift rate at the caldera centre reached approximately 25 millimetres per month, roughly 1 inch per month, and the seismicity record responded accordingly, producing some of the most intense earthquake activity of the entire modern unrest phase. Then, from around December 2025, the rate began to ease. By the early months of 2026, it had settled to something closer to 15 millimetres per month. The seismicity eased with it, but the coupling held throughout. The rate changed. The relationship between rate and seismicity did not. And 15 millimetres per month is not zero. The caldera was still inflating, still rising, still loading the rock above it with the slow, continuous mechanical stress that eventually, when a particular piece of that rock reaches its limit, produces an earthquake. The May 21st earthquake did not appear from nowhere. It did not fall out of a clear sky. It appeared from a caldera that has been inflating at varying speeds for years, that has risen by close to a human height at its centre, that has been loading and stressing and fracturing its own roof in a process that is documented, measured and published in the NGV's monitoring bulletins every single month. The 4.4 is what that process sounds like when a particularly large piece of the roof finally lets go. And the breathing ground, the bradyseism, the inflation, the coupling between uplift and seismicity is connected directly to the one scenario that the scientists watching this caldera find genuinely difficult to dismiss. Not the scenario most people picture when they think of a volcano, a quieter scenario, a faster one that can arrive without sending the warnings that everyone is counting on receiving. The scenario that worries scientists most at Campi Flegrei right now is not the one most people picture. Most people, when they think of a volcanic eruption, picture lava, or they picture the classic sequence: the mountain rumbling, the ash cloud building, the rivers of fire moving slowly enough that you can outrun them if you are paying attention. They picture a process that announces itself, a process that gives you time. The scenario that keeps volcanologists awake is not that one. It begins with water, a steam explosion. That is the plain language description. No lava required, no magma ascending through a conduit, no molten rock pushing toward the surface, No classical eruption sequence building through its recognizable stages, just water, hot rock, and the physics of what happens when the two meet in a confined space underground faster than the pressure can escape. The technical name is a phreatic eruption. The word comes from the Greek, phrea, meaning a well or a source of groundwater. A phreatic eruption is, at its core, a groundwater eruption. And here is the physics, stated in one paragraph because it is the kind of thing that is alarming precisely because it is so simple. Below the surface of the caldera, at varying depths, in the fractured rock, in the pores and channels of the geological structure, there is water. Groundwater. It has been there for as long as the rock has been there. Now imagine the water sitting in contact with rock that is hot. Not lava hot necessarily, so just hot. Hydrothermally heated. The kind of heat that the upward migration of volcanic gases and fluids produces in the shallow crust. The water absorbs that heat. It approaches boiling point. And at some moment, triggered by a sudden pressure drop by a new fracture opening, by a shift in the overlying rock, it crosses the threshold. It flashes to steam. Water turning to steam does not expand gradually. It expands by a factor of over 1,000, almost instantaneously. 1 unit of liquid water becomes more than 1,000 units of vapour in a fraction of a second in a space that cannot accommodate that expansion. The pressure has nowhere to go except outward and upward. It fractures the rock above it. It blasts that rock and everything built on top of it, away from the vent. In a confined underground space, a water-to-steam transition is not a process. It is a bomb. That is a phreatic eruption. No fresh magma required. Now walk through the ingredients, because the question that matters is not whether this scenario is theoretically possible at an active hydrothermal system. The question is whether the specific ingredients are present at Campi Flegrei right now. And the answer, across every monitoring parameter the NGV tracks, is yes. First, hydrothermal activity. The Solfatara crater, the most visible surface expression of the caldera's hydrothermal system, a wide bowl of pale ground where fumaroles hiss and the earth steams and the smell of sulphur reaches you from 100 meters away, has been running hotter and more energetically than its recent historical baseline. INGV temperature measurements at the main fumarolic vents have recorded elevated readings sustained over months. Gas flux measurements, the volume of volcanic gas escaping from the ground per unit of time, have similarly exceeded the longer-term averages that characterize quieter periods at this site. The hydrothermal system is not dormant. It is active, elevated, and has been for an extended period. Second, ground temperatures. Across the caldera, soil temperature measurements have risen. This is a separate signal from the fumarolic vent temperatures. It reflects the broader heating of the shallow rock by the upward migration of hot fluids. The INGV's monitoring network includes sensors specifically designed to track this parameter. The trend over the current unrest phase has been upward. Third, the uplift itself. The 148 centimetres of total rise at Rion Terra is not only a measure of inflation, it is also a measure of the mechanical stress being applied to the shallow rock as the ground is forced upward from below. That stress fractures the crust. It opens new pathways. It creates and widens the very channels through which pressurized hot fluid can migrate toward the surface, and through which, if the conditions are right, a flash-to-steam event could propagate upward. Fourth, the gas emissions at the surface. Volcanic gases at Campi Flegrei are not confined to the Solfatara. They seep from the ground across wide areas of the caldera. Carbon dioxide, in particular, is heavier than air and accumulates in low-lying spaces, cellars, ground floors, poorly ventilated rooms. The concentrations in some areas of the Flegrei towns have on occasion reached levels that prompted authorities to close schools, not because of an earthquake, not because of any dramatic volcanic event, because of the air inside the buildings. That is how persistent and pervasive the gas output of this system currently is. Every single ingredient for a phreatic eruption is present at Campi Flegrei right now. The heat, the water, the pressurized hydrothermal system, the fractured, stressed, uplifted rock sitting above it. The gas emissions at the surface confirming that the system is venting actively into the shallow crust. The ingredients are present. What is not yet present, and this distinction matters enormously, and the script will return to it, is a confirmed trigger. Conditions are loaded. An event is not inevitable, but the recipe is complete. Which brings us to the property of a phreatic eruption that makes it the scenario that dominates the quieter conversations among the scientists watching this caldera. The property that connects it directly back to the offshore earthquakes, to the monitoring gaps, to the evacuation plan, and everything that depends on it. The phreatic eruption does not have to announce itself. A classic magmatic eruption is, in a specific and important sense, cooperative. It cooperates with the people trying to detect it. Magma ascending through the crust displaces rock. That displacement produces earthquakes, not random ones, but earthquakes with a recognizable pattern, shallow, clustered, increasing in frequency as the magma gets closer to the surface. The ascending magma also deforms the ground above it, producing measurable tilt and uplift in a specific geometry that trained analysts can read. It changes the chemistry of the gases escaping from the volcanic system, shifting the ratios of sulfur dioxide to carbon dioxide in ways that reflect what is happening at depth. It leaves traces, multiple, independent, cross-confirming traces, accumulating across days or weeks, building toward a picture that a well-equipped monitoring network is specifically designed to recognize. The monitoring system at Campi Flegrei is built around that picture. The seismometers, the GPS stations, the gas sensors, the tilt meters, all of them are optimized at some level to catch the crescendo of a magmatic eruption in preparation. That is the scenario the architecture of the warning system is designed to detect. And for that scenario, the system is genuinely excellent. It would in all likelihood catch it. A phreatic eruption does not cooperate. It does not depend on magma moving. It does not require a crescendo of deepening earthquakes. It does not necessarily produce the specific gas chemistry shifts that signal ascending magma. The precursor sequence that the monitoring network is built to catch, the sequence that would trigger an alert level escalation from yellow to orange to red, that would set the evacuation machinery in motion, that would give people the days or hours they're counting on having, may simply never appear. The phreatic scenario can run entirely below the detection threshold of a system built to catch a different kind of event. It can be close to silent right up until it is not. Now, the May 21st earthquake. A strong, shallow earthquake striking a pressurized hydrothermal system is not a neutral event. The rock beneath the caldera is not a simple, uniform mass. It is fractured, cracked and re-cracked by years of thermal stress, by previous earthquakes, by the mechanical strain of the upward pushing inflation. Those fractures are the plumbing of the hydrothermal system. They are the pathways through which pressurized gas and superheated fluid migrate upward. And a strong, shallow earthquake, the kind that snaps a large piece of caldera roof and sends energy radiating through the shallow crust at 3.1 kilometres depth, can modify that plumbing. It can open new fractures. It can widen existing ones. It can suddenly connect a body of pressurized fluid below to a zone of lower pressure above, creating the exact pathway geometry that a phreatic eruption needs. As far as anyone can currently determine, the May 21st earthquake did not do that. The hydrothermal system did not fail in the hours that followed. No phreatic event occurred. The monitoring data in the aftermath did not show a step change in the parameters that would indicate a new and dangerous fracture pathway had opened. But the mechanism by which it could have is not exotic. It is not a fringe theory or a worst-case speculation confined to a single paper. It is the standard physical description of how strong, shallow earthquakes interact with pressurized hydrothermal systems, described in the volcanological literature, applicable to this caldera and relevant to every significant earthquake this system produces. The 4.4 did not pull the trigger. That is the news. The mechanism by which a future earthquake could is already written into the physics of the place. Now add the offshore dimension. The two largest earthquakes of the modern Campi Flegrei crisis both originated under the seafloor of the Gulf of Pozzuoli. That location carries a consequence that does not apply to the on-land core. If a phreatic explosion were to occur not beneath a town but beneath the sea floor, if the mechanism described above were to operate in the submarine western sector of the caldera rather than on land, it could displace water, not gradually, suddenly. An explosive release of energy under a shallow bay, displacing the water column above it. Water displaced suddenly by an underwater explosion is the generating mechanism of a tsunami. The Gulf of Pozzuoli is not a remote oceanic trench. It is a shallow enclosed bay opening onto the coastline of one of the most densely populated metropolitan areas in Europe. The beaches and seafronts of Pozzuoli, Bacoli, Naples itself, all are within the reach of a wave generated by a sudden underwater energy release in that basin. This needs to be stated with the precision it deserves, because precision is what separates useful information from panic. This is a low probability pathway. It is not a forecast. No monitoring agency is predicting a phreatic eruption, onshore or offshore. The submarine explosive scenario is not considered likely in any near-term assessment. What makes it worth naming is specifically and only the offshore location of the two largest earthquakes of this crisis. That location is what connects the theoretical pathway to the actual current hazard picture. Without those offshore epicenters, this pathway would remain an abstraction. With them, it has a geography. The ingredients for a phreatic eruption are present at Campi Flegrei. That is structural. It is a function of the current state of the monitoring data, and it is not in serious dispute. The occurrence of a phreatic eruption is contingent. It requires a trigger. No specific trigger has crossed the threshold that would indicate imminent failure, and the probability of an event in any given time window remains low. No precursor has escalated the INGV's alert level beyond yellow. No monitoring agency is sounding an alarm. What is also true is that the type of eruption most consistent with current conditions is the one least likely to provide the warning the evacuation plan depends on. The official line, that an eruption is not imminent, is true. It refers mostly to the magmatic scenario, the big, slow, detectable one that the monitoring architecture is built to catch. The phreatic scenario is a different animal. Its defining feature is that it can defeat the assumption of warning, and the plan that depends on that warning is the one every person in the red zone is trusting with their life. Here is the thing that changes everything. We have spent 4 parts underground. In the caldera, in the physics of a shallow earthquake and the geometry of an offshore epicenter, in the slow breathing of the ground and the superheated water sitting in fractured rock 2 kilometres below the surface. All of it real, all of it worth understanding, but none of it is the most dangerous character in this story. An earthquake does not by itself kill people. Buildings kill people. That sentence is worth sitting with, because it is the one that reframes the entire question of what makes Campi Flegrei dangerous. The shaking ground does not kill people. The falling masonry kills people. The collapsing floor kills people. The ceiling coming down on someone lying in their bed at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning kills people. The magnitude of the trigger matters, but it is almost secondary. What matters, what determines whether a given earthquake produces 0 deaths or produces a mass casualty event, is what the trigger hits, what the shaking finds when it arrives at the surface, what the buildings are made of, and how they respond when the ground underneath them moves. In Naples and the Flegrei towns, that question has a specific and well-documented answer. The construction type that dominates the historic heart of this region, the buildings where the majority of the population lives, works and sleeps, is unreinforced masonry. That phrase covers a range of materials: stone, brick, and most commonly here, tuffo. Tuffo is the soft, pale volcanic rock that the geology of Campania produces in abundance. It is easy to quarry, easy to cut, lightweight, insulating, workable. For 2,000 years it has been the default building material of this region. The Romans built with it. Medieval Naples was built with it. The dense residential warrens that fill the historic districts and the Flegrei towns are built with it. It is everywhere, in every wall, in every building that does not date from the modern era of reinforced concrete construction. And here is the structural problem with tuffo, with brick, with any unreinforced masonry. There is no skeleton. A modern earthquake-resistant building has a frame, a cage of reinforced concrete or steel that runs through the entire structure, columns, beams, connections, holding it together as a single integrated unit. When seismic waves arrive and push the building sideways, the frame flexes. The whole structure moves together, it sways and it absorbs the energy and it stays standing, because the cage keeps all the pieces connected to each other. An unreinforced masonry building has no cage. It is exactly what it sounds like. A careful stack of heavy pieces, blocks of tuffo, courses of brick, slabs of stone, held together by nothing but the grip of old mortar. The mortar is the only thing connecting the pieces, and mortar, especially mortar that is decades or centuries old, especially mortar that has been stressed by years of low-level seismic activity and thermal cycling, and the slow differential movement of subsiding and rising ground, does not grip forever. When seismic waves arrive at an unreinforced masonry building and push it sideways, the walls, which are strong when you load them vertically, weight pressing down from above, are weak when you load them horizontally, force pushing from the side. The connections between walls crack. The connections between the walls and the floors fail. Once a floor loses the support of the wall that was holding up its edge, that floor drops. It falls onto the floor below. The floor below, now loaded with the weight of the one above, also drops. This is the pancake collapse. This is the specific failure mode that kills people in earthquakes, because it converts a building into a stack of heavy horizontal slabs with very little survivable space between them. And it happens fast. That is what the building stock of Naples and the Flegrei towns is: old, unreinforced, mortar-bonded tuffo and brick, no internal frame, no cage, no flex. Structures that perform well under the vertical loads they were designed to carry, and poorly, in some cases catastrophically, under the lateral loads that a strong earthquake delivers. Now, the threshold. Structural engineers and specialists who have studied the Naples building stock have stated this on the record, in published assessments, in interviews, in language that sounds less like engineering and more like a forecast of something that has not happened yet. An earthquake in the magnitude 5.1 range striking this region could produce casualties on a catastrophic scale. Hundreds of thousands of people sit with that number, not dozens, not hundreds. Not the kind of toll that a moderate earthquake in a well-built city might produce. A few deaths, some injuries, a news cycle and a recovery. Hundreds of thousands in a single event. In a city that is still there the next morning, still standing in most of its outline, still recognizable from the air. A magnitude 5.1 is not a monstrous, rare, civilization-scale event. It is not the kind of number that requires an exceptional convergence of geological forces. Magnitude 5.1 earthquakes happen somewhere on Earth every few days. In a modern city, in Tokyo, in San Francisco, in Wellington or Christchurch after their retrofitting programs, a magnitude 5.1 is a bad morning. Broken windows, cracked plaster, frayed nerves and a spike in hardware store sales. People check the news and go back to work. The reason the same number means something completely different in Naples is not the geology, it is the masonry. The volcano sets the magnitude. The masonry sets the death toll. And the masonry in this case was built by people who could not have imagined the question we are now being forced to ask of their work. None of what follows is hidden. That is worth stating directly, because the gap between what is publicly documented and what is widely understood is itself part of the story. The NGV publishes its Campi Flegrei monitoring data continuously and in real time at Ingviro. Uplift measurements, seismicity records, gas flux readings, ground temperature data, all of it available to anyone with an internet connection. The Dipartimento della Protezione Civile, Italy's civil protection agency, publishes its Campi Flegrei risk assessments, its alert level criteria, and its evacuation zone documentation openly on its public website. Engineering assessments of Naples's building vulnerability exist in published academic literature, in municipal planning records, in reports commissioned by regional and national government. The vulnerability of the masonry, the scale of the uplift, the limitations of the evacuation plan, none of it is a secret held by scientists and withheld from the public. It is documented, it is published, it is findable by anyone who looks. The information exists. What has not kept pace with the information is the response to it. Because retrofitting a city is not like updating a monitoring network. You cannot upgrade unreinforced masonry by deploying a new sensor. The physical stock of buildings in Naples and the Flegrei towns, hundreds of thousands of structures ranging from post-war concrete blocks to medieval tuffo warrens to Roman-era foundations that have been continuously built upon for 2 millennia, cannot be made seismically resilient quickly, cheaply, or without disruption so severe that it amounts to temporary displacement of the people living inside them. Seismic retrofitting of an old masonry building is invasive by nature. It typically requires inserting steel reinforcement into walls, adding concrete cores or tie rods, strengthening floor-to-wall connections, work that in many cases cannot be done while the building is occupied, which means the families living in it must move out, temporarily, in theory. In practice, for the duration of a retrofit in a city with a tight housing market, temporary can stretch into years. Then multiply that disruption across not one building but an entire city. Across buildings that are often legally protected as historic structures, where the planning constraints on structural intervention are severe. Across buildings owned by families, often elderly, often asset-rich and cash-poor, who inherited their apartment from a grandparent and have no mechanism to fund an engineering project costing tens of thousands of euros per unit. The estimates for what a comprehensive seismic retrofit of Naples's most vulnerable building stock would cost run into figures that no municipal budget has been able to accommodate. The timelines for completing such a program, even under optimistic assumptions about funding and political will, are measured not in years but in decades. Generations in the more honest assessments. And those are the optimistic versions, the ones that assume the program starts now, continues without interruption, and does not run into the delays and cost overruns that define every large-scale urban infrastructure project in the historical record. The knowledge of what needs to be done is not the missing piece. The knowledge has existed for years. The missing piece is a mechanism for doing it at the speed and scale the hazard requires. That mechanism does not currently exist. Now look at what the May 21st earthquake showed us about the buildings, because it showed us something specific and it is worth reading carefully. The 4.4 was below the threshold where Naples's masonry fails in large numbers. That is the headline. No apartment blocks came down. Nobody died under a collapsed ceiling. But the earthquake was not harmless to the buildings, and the damage it produced is not a footnote. It is a preview. In Bacoli, the town closest to the offshore epicenter, reports describe fallen plaster across multiple properties, cracked walls, small structural collapses, the arch of the Belvedere de Baia, An old structure already carrying the weight of its own history failed at its weakest geometric point and came down. Along the rocky ridges and slopes around Bacoli, the shaking dislodged material that had been sitting in marginal stability for years and sent it moving. None of those events killed anyone. Each of them is the mechanism operating at low intensity. Fallen plaster is the surface of a masonry wall vibrating free of its backing, the first stage of the same process that, at higher intensity, separates the wall from the floor. A cracked wall is mortar, failing under lateral load, the same load that, applied with greater force for greater duration, propagates the crack until the connection breaks entirely. A collapsed arch is a structure reaching its load limit, the same limit that, for a load-bearing wall rather than a decorative arch, means the floor above loses its support. The Belvedere de Baia did not fall because the earthquake was catastrophic. It fell because the mechanism was present, and the arch was at the margin. Every cracked wall in Bacoli on the morning of May 21st is the masonry speaking in a quiet voice, telling you exactly how it behaves when the ground moves. And then there is the detail that the engineering assessments of the red zone have surfaced about some of the oldest residential buildings in Pozzuoli, the ones deepest inside the highest hazard area, the ones that have been continuously occupied through every phase of the bradyseism crisis, through the 1970s unrest and the 1982-84 crisis and the current one. Structural engineers have described some of these buildings as effectively leaning on each other, not standing independently, leaning. The mortar binding their walls has degraded over decades of seismic stress and thermal cycling and the slow, grinding movement of rising and falling ground until it has, in places, lost most of its cohesive strength, not crumbling visibly, not obviously dangerous to the eye, but degraded to something closer to powder than to bonding agent, holding its shape because it has not been disturbed, propped in position by the building next to it, which is propped in position by the building next to that. Those are the buildings where people sleep at 5:50 in the morning. The May 21st earthquake was a magnitude 4.4. It was mercifully below the threshold where Naples' masonry comes down in large numbers, but not by as much as the calm official language makes it sound. The question that follows, and the question the city has been deferring, is what happens when the order to leave finally comes. Whether the plan to get people out would actually work. The plan exists. That needs to be said first because it is true, and because the argument here is not that no one has thought about this problem. Someone has. Many people have. The Italian state has committed significant resources to thinking about it, documenting it, and constructing, on paper, a system designed to move people out of harm's way before the worst happens. The Dipartimento della Protezione Civile, Italy's national civil protection agency, has developed detailed evacuation planning for the Campi Flegrei red zone. The red zone is the highest hazard area. The roughly 500,000 residents living directly inside the caldera in Pozzuoli, Bacoli and the surrounding Flegrei towns, on the ground that would be most immediately affected by an eruption or a major seismic event. The planning is structured around a 4-level alert system: green, yellow, orange, red. Each level has defined thresholds, specific monitoring parameters that, if crossed, trigger escalation to the next tier. Each level has associated response protocols. At red, the protocol is evacuation. The document governing this is the Piano Nazionale di Protezione Civile per il Rischio Vulcanico ai Campi Flegrei, the National Civil Protection Plan for Volcanic Risk at Campi Flegrei. It names the zones. It specifies the routes. It assigns responsibilities to regional and municipal authorities. The current alert level is yellow. The plan is in force. The machinery is, in principle, ready to be activated. On paper, the plan exists. Now, the rehearsals. A plan that has never been tested is not a plan. It is document. The difference between a plan and a document is whether the people it depends on have actually walked through it, have moved, or practiced moving, or at minimum understood what moving would require. evacuation rehearsals have been conducted in the Campi Flegrei area. The results have been reported, and the reporting is, to put it plainly, not encouraging. Participation in the drills has been very low. When the rehearsals were held, large proportions of the people they were designed to protect did not take part. The reasons are understandable. We will come back to them. But the consequence is that a plan which depends on a population knowing what to do and where to go has, in practice, been rehearsed by only a fraction of that population. But the participation problem is not the deepest problem. The deeper problem is that the experts themselves, the volcanologists and earth scientists who have spent decades studying this specific caldera, who understand the hazard more precisely than anyone outside the monitoring agencies, have questioned on the record whether the plan would work at all, regardless of how many people attended the drills. Aldo Zollo, a seismologist at the University of Naples Federico II, who has studied Campi Flegrei for years, has been among those raising concerns about the gap between the evacuation plan as written and the evacuation as it would actually unfold. The specific concern is not bureaucratic. It is physical. It is about roads. When experts whose professional lives are dedicated to understanding this hazard say publicly that they are not confident the escape plan functions, that is not a footnote in a risk assessment. That is a warning from the people best placed to give it. And here is the physical problem underneath all of it. An evacuation is not, at its core, a planning problem or a communication problem or even a participation problem. An evacuation is a transportation problem. It is the problem of moving a very large number of people out of a defined geographic area in a limited amount of time along a finite number of roads. Everything else, the alert levels, the zone maps, the rehearsals, the public information campaigns, is scaffolding around that central physical constraint. The roads are the plan. If the roads work, the plan can work. If the roads fail, nothing else matters. The roads that a Campi Flegrei evacuation would depend on, the arterial routes that connect the red zone to the wider road network and that would carry the outward flow of hundreds of thousands of people, include sections of the Tangenziale di Napoli, the elevated ring road that runs across the northern edge of the city and provides the primary high-capacity connection between the western Flegrei area and the routes leading east and north away from the caldera. The Tangenziale is, in engineering terms, a vulnerable structure. Elevated sections supported on columns, overpasses, bridges, the kind of infrastructure that performs adequately under normal conditions and that, under the lateral loading of a strong earthquake, is at risk of the same failure modes that affect any reinforced concrete structure of its era. The seismic upgrades required to make those critical routes reliably survivable in a strong earthquake have not been completed. The reinforcement works have been planned. They have been funded, at least in part. They are projected to continue until at least the end of 2027. End of 2027 is the official projection. It is worth naming what official projections for large infrastructure works in complex urban environments have historically tended to mean in practice. They mean that is the date when the work is scheduled to be complete under the most favourable assumptions about procurement, weather, contractor performance, and the discovery of unforeseen complications, which in a region where construction routinely encounters layers of Roman and medieval archaeology is not an abstract risk. End of 2027 is the optimistic version. The realistic completion date is later. How much later is unknown. What is known is that between now and whenever those works are finished, the roads that the evacuation plan depends on remain in their current state, partially upgraded, partially not, and exposed, like everything else in this city, to the same earthquake that would make the evacuation necessary in the first place. The official evacuation plan is built around 500,000 people. That is the red zone population, the residents of Pozzuoli, Bacoli, and the surrounding Flegrei towns who live directly inside the caldera's highest hazard area. The plan names them, it zones them, it assigns them evacuation routes and reception areas, and a sequence of actions tied to the alert level escalation. 500,000 people is already an extraordinary number to move quickly along a finite network of roads. But 500,000 is not the number that matters on the worst morning. The number that matters is 6 million. That is the population of the wider Naples metropolitan area. And when an evacuation order goes out for the red zone, when the siren sound and the official word comes and the people of Pozzuoli start loading their cars, the people in the yellow zone adjacent to the red zone will not consult the civil protection website to confirm that their zone has not yet been called. The people in the eastern suburbs of Naples will not sit calmly in their apartments, watching the news and waiting for instructions that may never come for them. The people on the far side of the city who felt their beds move at 5:50 in the morning will make their own calculation. And that calculation, for an enormous number of them, will be, if it is serious enough to evacuate Pozzuoli, it is serious enough to leave Naples. This is called the shadow evacuation. It is not a fringe scenario or a planning document footnote. It is what happens in every major emergency where a partial evacuation order is issued in a densely populated area. The unplanned, spontaneous flight of people outside the official zone who are making rational decisions based on what they can see around them. The shadow evacuation can dwarf the planned one many times over. It produces a volume of movement on the road network that the roads were never designed to carry, that no traffic model built around a defined zone evacuation has fully accounted for, and that does not stop because an official communication tells people their zone is not yet called. The roads were not built for 6 million people trying to leave at once. They were not built for it even in optimal conditions on a normal day, with no damage, no rubble, no structural failures. They cannot carry that load. And on the morning when the load arrives, the conditions will not be optimal. They may, in fact, already be worse than normal before the earthquake even happens. Sections of the road network in the Flegrei area, including routes that are relevant to any westward or northward evacuation, are currently subject to construction works. The seismic reinforcement program that is projected to run until the end of 2027, and realistically beyond it, requires active construction on and around the structures being upgraded. Construction means equipment. Construction means lane closures. Construction means sections of road that are already narrowed, already partially obstructed, already carrying the weight of an ongoing infrastructure project before any emergency has begun. There have been documented instances of evacuation-relevant routes in the Flegrei and Naples area being reduced to single lanes or partially blocked by construction staging. Not in a future scenario. Now. The escape routes are, in places, already compromised by the work that is meant eventually to make them safer. The program that is supposed to produce more resilient evacuation infrastructure is, in the short term, producing more obstructed evacuation infrastructure. That is not irony. It is engineering reality. You cannot reinforce a road without temporarily reducing its capacity. Now put it all together. The earthquake that creates the need to flee is the same earthquake that can destroy the means of fleeing. Walk the chain, because the chain is the argument and it deserves to be walked clearly. A strong earthquake strikes, not necessarily a volcanic eruption, not the red zone scenario with days of warning. Just an earthquake, a magnitude that sits in the range that structural engineers have already identified as catastrophic for this building stock. The shaking arrives. The unreinforced masonry responds the way unreinforced masonry responds. Walls crack, connections fail, floors drop. Buildings come down, not all buildings, not everywhere simultaneously. But in the dense residential streets of the Flegrei towns and the historic districts of Naples, enough buildings. The collapses produce rubble. The rubble falls into the streets. The streets are the roads. The roads are the evacuation routes. The same roads whose bridges and elevated sections and column-supported overpasses are made of the same vulnerable materials, exposed to the same shaking, on the same morning, at the same moment that the buildings are coming down around them. The escape route and the hazard are not separate things. They are not the volcano over here and the exit road over there. They are physically entangled. The thing that makes the evacuation necessary is the same thing that can make the evacuation impossible. The earthquake does not create a problem and then leave the solution intact. It can destroy both simultaneously. That is the structural trap. That is what no alert level system, no rehearsal, no civil protection document can fully plan around, because it is not a failure of planning. It is a failure of geometry. The city is built the way it is built, and the roads run where they run, and the same shaking reaches everything at once. The people of Naples did not panic because they are fragile. They panicked because they did the arithmetic. The 4.4 was the first domino. It was the magnitude at which the chain begins, not the magnitude at which it ends. They know what the rest of the chain looks like. They have known for years. They know because the history of this place is written in the rock beneath their feet, and in the cultural memory of everyone who has lived here long enough to understand what that rock has done before. 4 layers now visible: the earthquake, the masonry, the roads, the evacuation that cannot be relied upon. One thread still running. The question of why this population reads the situation with such clarity, with such immediate, instinctive, historically grounded dread, takes us somewhere else entirely. Into the past, into a mountain that rose from the sea in 8 days, and the marble columns that were underwater for 1,000 years, and the 40,000 people who were relocated off this volcano within living memory. In Pozzuoli, in the old heart of the town, there is a Roman market hall. It was built in the 1st century AD as a macellum, a covered market. Columns and a central courtyard where fish and meat and grain were sold, in what was then one of the busiest ports in the Roman world. It is called, by a historical misidentification that stuck, the Temple of Serapis. It was never a temple, but its columns have told a story that no temple inscription could have matched. 3 of the original marble columns are still standing, and if you look at them closely, partway up each column, you see something that should not be there. A band. A zone of the marble that is pitted and bored through with small holes in a pattern recognizable to anyone who has studied marine biology. Those holes were made by lithophagous mollusks, stone-boring bivalves that drill into hard surfaces to make their homes. They can only do this work underwater, below sea level, submerged in the sea. The Roman market was built on dry land, which means that at some point after it was built, the ground beneath it sank. Not quickly, slowly, century by century, in the measured downward breathing of a caldera in a deflation phase, the surface of the land descended. The market floor went below the water. The columns went below the water. The bivalves moved in and drilled their boreholes into the marble at the depth where they lived for as long as the columns stood submerged. By around the year 1000 AD, the site had sunk to roughly 11 metres below sea level. The boreholes are still there, at the height they were drilled. A permanent record of where the sea surface once was relative to the stone, and then the ground rose again. The caldera began to inflate. The land lifted. Slowly, over centuries, the market floor came back up out of the water. The columns emerged. The boreholes, now metres above the sea surface, were left in the air exactly where they had been drilled. Preserved in marble, a tide gauge that no one commissioned and no one could have planned, recording in stone the full arc of a bradyseism cycle spanning roughly 1,000 years. Total descent, approximately 11 metres. Total rise back, approximately 12 metres. The columns are above sea level again. They have been for several centuries, but the boreholes remain, halfway up the stone, at the height where the sea once was, telling anyone who looks the story of what the ground here does. This is not a new phenomenon. The bradyseism that has lifted Rion Terra by 148 centimetres in the current crisis, nearly 5 feet in a few decades, is the same process that took those columns underwater for a millennium. It has been running in one phase or another for as long as this caldera has existed. The ground here breathes. The marble columns are the proof, but the columns are not the entry in the ledger that sits heaviest. For that, we go to the end of September 1538. In the decades before 1538, the people living around Campi Flegrei would have recognised every sign we have been describing. The ground was rising, the coast was changing. Contemporary accounts describe the strangeness, the shoreline moving, the sea retreating as the land rose beneath it, fish stranded in what had been shallow water, left behind by a sea being pushed back by ground that refused to stay still. In the final weeks before the eruption, the rate of uplift accelerated sharply. Roughly 4 to 4.5 metres of ground rise in a compressed span of time. The land was moving fast enough that people recorded it as remarkable, even against the backdrop of years of strange ground behaviour. And then, over approximately 8 days at the end of September 1538, the ground opened. A pyroclastic eruption began near the coast between Pozzuoli and the sea. It was explosive, ash, rock fragments, pyroclastic material blasted outward from a vent that had not existed the week before, and as the eruption continued, the ejected material built up around the vent. It accumulated. A cone took shape from nothing. When it was over, a new hill stood where flat ground had been. Over 100 metres tall, they called it Monte Nuovo, the new mountain. A hill that did not exist on the 1st of September 1538 stood on the 9th. Now, the restraint this fact requires. Monte Nuovo was, by the standards of what Campi Flegrei is geologically capable of, a modest eruption. This is a caldera that in its deep past produced events of a scale that blanketed large parts of Europe in ash. The Campanian ignimbrite, deposited roughly 39,000 years ago, is one of the largest volcanic events in European geological history. Monte Nuovo was nothing like that. A localized pyroclastic cone, devastating to the small communities around the vent, but minor by any geological standard. When the current crisis is compared to 1538, the comparison being made is to a specific, modest, historically documented pattern. Years of ground uplift, a period of acceleration, then a relatively contained eruption. The resemblance to the first two beats of that pattern, the sustained uplift, the periods of acceleration, is real. The monitoring data supports it. That resemblance is not the same as predicting the third beat. Most bradyseism episodes do not end in eruption. They end in quiescence. But most is not all. And the people of the Flegrei fields know the difference, because 1538 is in their history books and their cultural memory and the landscape they walk through every day. Monte Nuovo is visible from Pozzuoli. You can see the hill from the waterfront. The mountain born in 8 days is still there. The marble columns take the ledger back 1,000 years. Monte Nuovo takes it back 5 centuries. But the entry that sits closest, the one that is not history for many of the people living in the Flegrei towns but memory, is from 1982. In the early 1980s, Campi Flegrei went through a bradyseism crisis that was, by any measure, traumatic. It did not begin dramatically. It began the way these things begin, with small earthquakes, with instruments registering a change in the rate of uplift, with scientists noting that the ground was rising faster than it had been, and then it kept going. Between roughly 1982 and 1984, the ground at the centre of the caldera rose by approximately 1.8 metres, close to 6 feet in 2 years. Over that same period, the caldera generated more than 16,000 earthquakes. Not in a single swarm, not in a single season, over 2 years relentlessly, the ground cracking and re-cracking as the rock above the inflating system absorbed and released the stress. The strongest reached around magnitude 4.0, not catastrophic by any global standard, but 16,000 earthquakes over 2 years in a town of dense old masonry means 16,000 events that crack plaster, widen existing fractures, shake loose the mortar that holds tufo blocks together, and remind everyone who lives there, again and again, of what the ground beneath them is doing. Buildings cracked, repeatedly. The same buildings cracking again after each repair, because the ground was still moving and the source of the stress had not stopped. The cumulative damage was severe enough, and the resemblance to the pattern preceding known eruptions unsettling enough, that the Italian government made a decision that was, in its scale and speed, extraordinary. They moved people. Approximately 40,000 residents of Pozzuoli were permanently relocated, not temporarily evacuated, relocated. The government built a new town to receive them, Monterosiello, constructed on higher and safer ground on the outskirts of the municipality, away from the active caldera. Roads, housing blocks, schools, shops, a functioning community built essentially from nothing, for the specific purpose of moving tens of thousands of people off the most dangerous ground in the Italian volcanic system. 40,000 people, a new town, built to receive them. The Italian state looked at a bradyseism crisis, recognized the resemblance to historical precedents, and chose to physically remove a large population from the hazard before anything catastrophic happened. That is what 1982-84 produced. And then the crisis faded. The ground, as it periodically does, stopped its accelerating rise. The seismicity eased. The acute phase passed. Monterosiello stood, newly built, populated by its 40,000 relocated residents. And over the years that followed, as the crisis receded into memory, as the volcano went quiet, as the daily reality of displacement and the deep human attachment to a place that families had occupied for generations pressed harder and harder on the people who had left, the red zone began to fill again. People drifted back, not all at once, not dramatically. Gradually over years, through small decisions and economic pressures, and the simple fact that a quiet volcano does not feel like a reason to stay away from the neighborhood where you grew up, the house your parents owned, the street where everyone knows your name. The relocation was real. It was decisive. At the time, it was arguably one of the most significant acts of preemptive volcanic risk management in European history. And the long quiet that followed undid much of it. This is the problem that experts pushing for gradual permanent depopulation of the red zone today are confronting. And it is a harder problem than it might appear. It is not only the difficulty of persuading people to leave, it is the much deeper difficulty of keeping the ground empty once the volcano goes quiet. A loud, active, frightening crisis creates the conditions under which people will accept displacement. The moment the crisis fades, the conditions for keeping the displacement in place fade with it. The incentive to return and the ability to return are both present. The arguments for staying away become abstract. The arguments for going back are immediate, personal, economic, and embedded in everything that makes a place feel like home. So the red zone today is not empty. It is populated again, not as densely as it was before 1982, but substantially. People live there. They raise children there. They sleep there at 5:50 in the morning when the caldera decides to move. Now, the ledger. The people of the Flegrei towns who woke to the 4.4 on May 21, 2026, were not reading that event against a blank background. They were not encountering for the first time the idea that this ground is dangerous. They were not unfamiliar with the concept that a caldera can produce earthquakes, and that those earthquakes come with consequences. They were reading it through the marble columns, the 1,000-year tide gauge proving the ground has drowned and resurfaced before, that this is not a modern aberration but a permanent condition of the place. They were reading it through 1538, the documented precedent of a long uplift that ended over 8 days in a mountain that did not previously exist. They were reading it through 1982-84. For some of them not history at all but personal memory. 16,000 earthquakes, buildings cracking repeatedly, a government moving 40,000 of their neighbours to a new town on safer ground. And they were reading it through the knowledge, fresh from June 2025, that this caldera had already produced its strongest shaking in 40 years just 11 months earlier. that the 4.4 of May 2026 was not the first strong event of this crisis, that it was the second, that both had come from offshore. When a magnitude 4.4 arrives on top of all of that, at 5:50 in the morning from a strange direction, followed by silence, it does not land as an isolated event. It does not land as a moderate tremor that can be filed away and forgotten. It lands as the latest entry in a very long, very personal, very specific ledger. When the May 21st earthquake arrived, it did not land on a blank slate. It landed on a population that knows in its bones what this caldera has done before. And that knowledge is why the silence, the absence of official information in the minutes that followed, hit as hard as it did. The marble columns record centuries. Monte Nuovo records a single catastrophic week. But the entry in the ledger that lives closest to the surface, the one that is not history for the older residents of Pozzuoli, but memory, personal memory, the kind you carry in your body rather than read in a book, is from 1982. Between roughly 1982 and 1984, Campi Flegrei went through a bradyseism crisis that was, for the town of Pozzuoli, traumatic in the clinical sense of that word. The ground rose by approximately 1.8 metres over 2 years, not the gradual millimetre by millimetre accumulation of the current crisis, logged by GPS stations and reported in monthly bulletins, fast enough to be felt, fast enough to change the harbour, to alter the geometry of streets, to make buildings that had stood for generations suddenly uneven and cracked and wrong. And the rising ground came with earthquakes, thousands of them, more than 16,000 earthquakes over the course of the crisis, one after another, week after week, for 2 years. The strongest reached around magnitude 4.0, roughly comparable to the May 21st event, but a single magnitude 4.0 arriving after 15,000 Nostinkia smaller earthquakes lands very differently from a magnitude 4.0 arriving after a quiet few months. Buildings cracked, then cracked again, then cracked further. The tuffo walls, the degraded mortar, the structures that lean on their neighbours, all of it was being shaken repeatedly, progressively, its remaining cohesion reduced a little more with each tremor, its marginal stability tested again and again without reprieve. The Italian government made a decision. It relocated approximately 40,000 Pozzuoli residents, roughly a third of the town's population at the time, off the most dangerous ground and onto higher, safer land to the north. It built a new town for them. The town was named Monteroschiello. New housing, new streets, new infrastructure, constructed specifically to receive people being moved off a volcano that would not stop shaking. 40,000 people. A forced migration in peacetime in a democracy in one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, because the ground would not stop moving and the buildings would not stop cracking, and the government concluded that the people living there could not safely stay. That relocation happened. It was real. It was by any measure an extraordinary act of preventive caution, the state looking at a bradyseism crisis, recognizing the pattern and choosing to physically remove a large population from the most dangerous ground before something catastrophic forced the issue. And then the crisis faded. The ground slowed its rise. The earthquakes diminished in frequency and intensity. The caldera entered a quieter phase. Monteroschiello stood, and many of its residents stayed. It became a real town with schools and shops and a community that put down roots. But the Flegrei towns themselves, the ones that had been partially empty, did not stay empty. People drifted back. The red zone, which the government had worked so hard to depopulate, slowly refilled. Life reasserted itself. Economics reasserted themselves. The deep human attachment to a place, to the street where your family has lived for generations, to the view of the bay, to the community and the history and the identity that comes with a specific piece of ground, proved stronger than the memory of 16,000 earthquakes, once those earthquakes had stopped. A quiet volcano does not feel like a reason to stay away. The experts who are today pushing for a gradual, voluntary, permanent depopulation of the red zone, Not a forced relocation, not a dramatic evacuation, but a quiet long-term policy of not allowing new residents in, of not reoccupying homes when families leave, of slowly reducing the number of people living on the most dangerous ground, are not fighting only the difficulty of moving people. Anyone who has studied the 1982-84 crisis and its aftermath understands that the harder problem is keeping ground empty once the volcano goes quiet. The crisis creates the political and psychological conditions for depopulation. The quiet that follows destroys them. That is the trap inside the trap, and it is the context in which the May 21st earthquake landed. The current population of the Flegrei towns and the wider Naples area is not reading this earthquake against a blank background. They are reading it through everything, through the marble columns and their bivalve boreholes, proving that the ground here has gone underwater and come back, and the process is older than the city itself. Through the hill visible from the Pozzuoli waterfront, Monte Nuovo, over 100 metres of ash and pyroclastic rock that appeared in 8 days at the end of a period of uplift that looked, in its first 2 beats, like the one they are living through now. Through the personal or family memory of 16,000 earthquakes and cracking walls, and 40,000 neighbours relocated to a new town on higher ground, within the last lifetime because the caldera would not stop shaking, and through the knowledge, fresh from June 2025, that this system can still produce its strongest earthquake in 40 years, from a direction that surprised everyone, with a magnitude that cracked walls and collapsed an islet ridge and stopped railway traffic across the region. When a magnitude 4.4 arrives on top of all of that, at 5:50 in the morning, from a strange offshore direction, followed by a silence where the official information should have been, it does not land as an isolated data point. It does not land as a moderate tremor that hurt nobody and can be filed away and forgotten. It lands as the latest entry in a very long, very personal ledger. When the May 21st earthquake arrived, it did not land on a blank slate. It landed on a population that knows in its bones what this caldera has done before, on centuries, on decades, on years of accumulated evidence that the ground here is not finished with them. And that knowledge is why the silence, the absence of official information in the minutes that followed, the blank screens, the unanswered question, hit as hard as it did. We need to go back to the screens. In the minutes after the 5:50 a.m. shock, after the shaking stopped and the swarm continued and the people of Pozzuoli and Bacoli and Naples stood in their door frames, or sat on the edges of their beds, or went out into the streets in the early morning dark, they did what people in this region have learned to do. They reached for their phones, they opened the NGV website, they searched the USGS earthquake feed. They looked for the official word. Where was it? How big was it? Is it over? What comes next? And for a meaningful stretch of time, the screen showed nothing. The USGS did eventually publish a preliminary location and magnitude, around 4.1 in a slightly wrong position. Before the number was corrected upward and the location revised, the NGV published its own parameters in turn. The picture clarified gradually over the course of the morning, but for the window between the shaking and the first official word, a city of millions was refreshing blank screens. That is not incompetence. It is the ordinary, unglamorous reality of how earthquake monitoring works in the first minutes after a significant event. Raw signals arrive at the network stations almost instantly. But converting those signals into a published result requires processing, triangulating the source from dozens of stations, estimating the magnitude from the amplitudes, running the automatic algorithms, having analysts check and correct the automatic solution. The first answer is always approximate, it always gets refined. On the morning of May 21st, the time the process took was long enough to matter. Understanding why the silence happened does not undo the damage the silence did. That silence was functionally part of the earthquake, because what filled it was not patience. The explanation that spread through group chats and conversations in the street during the gap between the shaking and the official word was the one that is always waiting at Campi Flegrei. They know. The authorities know exactly what happened. They know it is serious, and they are not telling us because they do not want to cause panic. Let us engage that directly, because the people who believe it are not stupid, and they are not paranoid, and they do not deserve to be dismissed. They are people who are shaken awake at 5:50 in the morning, who reach for the system they have been told to trust and found it silent. The distrust is not irrational. The conspiracy framing is wrong. The soil it grows in is real. Now, why it is wrong. A coordinated suppression of earthquake data would require multiple independent agencies to act in concert, in real time, within minutes of the event. It would require the USGS to participate. The United States Geological Survey, which operates independently of Italian government and Italian politics, which has no institutional interest in managing public perception of a volcanic crisis in the Bay of Naples, and which published a preliminary result that was wrong. That last detail is the key. A cover-up does not publish a wrong number. A cover-up publishes nothing, or it publishes something reassuring. It does not publish a preliminary magnitude of 4.1 in a slightly wrong location, and then let the correct figure emerge through the normal revision process. The blurry, self-correcting, internally inconsistent way the data appeared on the morning of May 21st. Different numbers from different agencies, preliminary results superseded by revised results, a picture that clarified gradually, is not what managed suppression looks like. It is exactly what unmanaged real-time seismological data looks like when no one is controlling the narrative because no one is trying to. But here is what the conspiracy framing gets partially right, because the partial truth is legitimate. A population living under this level of volcanic stress deserves faster, clearer, more honest public communication in the immediate aftermath of a significant earthquake. The gap between what the NGV's internal systems knew in real time and what the public-facing databases showed that morning was too wide. That is a fair criticism, not of the science. The science was working as designed, but of the communication architecture. The lesson is not that anyone lied. It is simpler. In a world where official silence is never actually silence, where every minute without an authoritative answer is a minute filled by rumour, the cost of being slow has gone up. Every minute the official source is silent is a minute donated to the conspiracy. The fix is not complicated. Get faster. Publish a rough number with a clear label, preliminary, subject to revision, rather than waiting for certainty that takes 20 minutes to arrive. Be willing to say, in real time, we felt it too. Here is what we know right now. Here is what we do not know yet. Here is when we expect to know more. A frightened population can handle uncertainty. What it cannot handle is silence. There are two other narratives that circulate after every significant Campi Flegrei earthquake, and they deserve the same direct treatment the conspiracy framing received. One is a misreading, one is a genuine failure. Conflating them helps no one. The first is the supervolcano framing. Address it flatly. Campi Flegrei producing an eruption in the current unrest phase, a Monte Nuovo scale event, a localized pyroclastic cone, dangerous to communities in the immediate area, is a possibility the science takes seriously. It is not the most likely outcome of the current crisis, but it is a physically real pathway. Campi Flegrei producing one of its colossal deep past continent blanketing super eruptions is a categorically different kind of event. The Campanian ignimbrite, deposited roughly 39,000 years ago, covered large parts of Europe in ash. That is the event the supervolcano framing gestures toward. It belongs to a different order of magnitude, a different order of precursor activity, and a different geological context than anything in the current monitoring data. Nothing in the current data, not the uplift rate, not the seismicity level, not the gas chemistry, not the deformation geometry, points toward a super eruption. The NGV alert level is yellow. A restless caldera is not a caldera on the verge of its worst case. These are different things. Treating them as the same is the single most common error in public discussion of this volcano, and it does real harm in both directions. generating fear disproportionate to the actual hazard and eroding the credibility of legitimate concern when every earthquake is treated as the opening act of an apocalypse. The second narrative is not a misreading. It is a genuine failure, and it deserves to be named as one. Volcanologists have argued for years for a policy of gradual permanent depopulation of the red zone. Not forced evacuation. Something quieter. Stop issuing new building permits in the highest hazard areas. When a family leaves a red zone property, do not allow it to be reoccupied. Retire it. Over a generation, slowly reduce the number of people living directly on top of the most dangerous ground. That policy has not been implemented. This is not evidence of a hidden agenda. It is evidence of how brutally hard it is to move people off land their families have held for generations. The political cost, the legal complexity of property rights, the economic impossibility for families who cannot sell a home they also cannot safely live in. The social reality that people do not leave a place simply because a scientist has assessed it as dangerous. None of that makes the failure less real. The science is clear. The recommendation has been made repeatedly by credible experts in published literature and public statements. The red zone population is larger than the science recommends. That gap is a genuine unresolved policy failure. It deserves to be named as one. Now. The genuinely open question. The two largest earthquakes of the modern crisis, the 4.6 of June 2025 and the 4.4 of May 2026, both originated in the submarine western sector of the caldera. The question remains open. Is the most energetic strain release migrating from the densely instrumented on-land core toward the less covered offshore flank? No agency has declared a confirmed shift. 2 data points is not a trend. What is true is that the INGV and the broader volcanological community are watching the offshore seismicity pattern closely. Research into the submarine structure of the western caldera flank, its fault geometry, its relationship to the onland unrest, is ongoing. The next significant earthquake will either confirm the pattern or dissolve it. Until then, the honest position is, we do not know. We are watching, and the watching matters. The warning and evacuation system at Campi Flegrei is built around one specific scenario: magma ascending slowly, producing a recognizable crescendo of precursors across days or weeks, triggering a structured escalation through the alert levels, enabling an ordered phased evacuation. That is the scenario the architecture is optimized to catch. The seismometer networks, the deformation monitoring, the gas sensors, the alert level thresholds, all calibrated, at least in part, to detect that slow onset magmatic sequence. The phreatic scenario can bypass that architecture entirely. It does not require ascending magma. It does not produce the recognizable precursor sequence. It can escalate from background to crisis faster than the alert level system is designed to track. That mismatch between the architecture of the warning system and the architecture of the most plausible sudden hazard is not a secret. It is named explicitly in the peer-reviewed volcanological literature on phreatic eruptions and volcanic crisis management. It is a structural design problem. The system was built for the event it can best detect, which is not the same as the event most likely to arrive without warning. Fixing it requires investment in submarine monitoring, faster communication protocols, and alert-level criteria that account for the phreatic pathway alongside the magmatic one. That work is ongoing, it is not complete. And until it is, the gap between what the system is built to catch and what the physics of this caldera can produce remains exactly where it was on the morning of May 21st. There are 2 other narratives that circulate after every significant Campi Flegrei earthquake, and they deserve direct treatment. The first is the supervolcano narrative. The claim, repeated in social media posts and sometimes in headlines that should know better, that the earthquake signals Campi Flegrei awakening toward one of the colossal eruptions of its deep geological past. Let us be direct. Campi Flegrei producing a Monte Nuovo-scale event, a modest localized pyroclastic eruption like 1538, is a real possibility the science takes seriously. It is within the range of outcomes the monitoring agencies are watching for. Campi Flegrei producing one of its colossal deep-pass super eruptions is a different category of event by orders of magnitude. The Campanian ignimbrite, deposited roughly 39,000 years ago, blanketed large parts of Europe. Events of that scale occur on timescales of tens of thousands of years. Nothing in the current monitoring data, not the uplift rate, not the seismicity, not the gas chemistry, not the alert level, points toward an event in that category. A restless caldera is not a caldera on the verge of its worst case. Conflating Monte Nuovo with the Campanian ignimbrite is the single most common error in public discussion of this volcano. It makes the real risk harder to communicate. It gives people who want to dismiss the hazard a justification for doing so. If the claim is obviously exaggerated, the underlying concern can be dismissed with it. The second narrative is different. It is not a misreading of the science. It is a real, unresolved policy failure, and it deserves to be named as one. For years, volcanologists studying Campi Flegrei have argued for gradual, voluntary, permanent depopulation of the red zone. Not forced evacuation, not emergency relocation. Something quieter. Stop issuing building permits in the red zone. When a family leaves, do not allow the home to be reoccupied. Retire it. Over a generation, reduce the number of people living on the most dangerous ground. That policy has not been implemented. Building has continued. The population of the highest hazard area has not meaningfully declined through deliberate policy choice. This is not a conspiracy. It is evidence of how brutally difficult it is to act on known long-term risk in real political and economic conditions. Families who have lived in the red zone for generations have property rights, community ties, and economic dependencies. Politicians face constituencies who vote and resist. The legal, financial, and social architecture of the problem is genuinely formidable. The difficulty does not make it less of a failure. People are sleeping tonight in degraded masonry on the most dangerous ground in an active caldera, in a city whose evacuation routes are not seismically ready. The scientific community has said for years that this is not sustainable. The policy response has been inadequate. Both are true. Now, the genuinely open question. The two largest earthquakes of the modern crisis, the 4.6 of June 2025 and the 4.4 of May 2026, both originated in the submarine western sector of the caldera, near Boccoli, in the Gulf of Pozzuoli. 2 data points, not a confirmed trend. The next major earthquake could come from the on-land core, exactly as the historical pattern predicts, and the offshore pattern could dissolve into coincidence. But if it holds, if the offshore sector continues to produce the most energetic strain release of this unrest phase, the monitoring system faces a structural problem. Seafloor instrumentation is harder to deploy, harder to maintain, and less redundant than land-based networks. The offshore western flank is the part of the caldera where coverage is thinnest. The NGV is aware of this. Monitoring offshore seismicity at Campi Flegrei has been addressed in published work examining the caldera's submarine structure and its contribution to the overall hazard picture. Whether a genuine migration of the most energetic activity toward the offshore sector is occurring is a question the agency will be watching in every significant event that follows May 21st. Underneath all of it, the offshore pattern, the policy failure, the conspiracy framing, the supervolcano misreading, there is a structural problem that connects them. The warning and evacuation system is built for one specific scenario: magma ascending over days or weeks, producing an escalating pattern of earthquakes, deformation, and gas chemistry shifts, triggering the alert level escalation from yellow to orange to red, giving civil protection time to order an evacuation. That system is well designed for that scenario, for the most plausible sudden hazard, the phreatic eruption, the steam explosion that does not depend on ascending magma, and does not produce the precursor crescendo. The monitoring architecture is built to detect. The system offers much less. The mismatch between the architecture of the warning system and the architecture of the most likely sudden danger is not a secret. It appears in the volcanological literature. Researchers have written about the challenge of providing adequate warning for phreatic events at hydrothermally active calderas. The problem is named, it has not been solved. This is not a failure of the scientists or the monitoring engineers. The NGV network is genuinely excellent at what it is designed to do. It is a structural design problem, a system optimized for the detectable scenario, being asked to cover a hazard type that may not produce the signals it is designed to catch. The answer is not to criticize the people running the network. The answer is to be honest about what the network can and cannot guarantee, and to build the response system on that honest foundation, rather than on an assumption of warning the phreatic scenario cannot reliably provide. 80C. Here is what you now know, that the person who only saw the headline does not. You know that the May 21st earthquake came from the wrong place, offshore, in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, near Boccoli, from the submarine western flank of the caldera, rather than the on-land core that the monitoring network is built around. And you know that the same offshore sector produced the strongest earthquake at this caldera in 40 years, just 11 months earlier. 2 events, the same location. A question that no agency has yet answered. Coincidence or pattern? You know what hydrothermal means and what it does not mean. It does not mean the magma is ascending. It does not mean harmless. It means the immediate driver is pressurized gas and superheated fluid rather than rising molten rock, which is somewhat less alarming than the alternative and which is a snapshot of current conditions, not a guarantee about next month's. You know that the monitoring agencies are not hiding alarm. They are reporting accurately the honest state of a system that is active, elevated and unresolved. You know about the phreatic eruption. You know it is a steam explosion, not a lava flow. You know it does not require ascending magma. You know that every ingredient for one is present at Campi Flegrei right now. The heat, the water, the pressurized hydrothermal system, the fractured, stressed rock above it, the persistent gas emissions at the surface. And you know the property that makes it the scenario that dominates the quieter conversations among the scientists. It can arrive without the precursor sequence the warning system is built to catch. The warning everyone is counting on may not come. You know the magnitude 5.1 threshold and what it means. Not a monstrous rare event, a number that happens somewhere on Earth every few days. Here, in a city of old unreinforced tuffo masonry, with no internal steel skeleton, in buildings whose mortar has in places degraded to powder, in structures that lean on their neighbours to stay upright. That number means hundreds of thousands. Structural engineers have said so on the record. That is not speculation. That is the engineering assessment of what this building stock does at that magnitude. You know the structural trap. The earthquake that creates the need to flee is the same earthquake that can destroy the means of fleeing. Masonry fails. Rubble falls into the streets. The streets are the roads. The roads are the evacuation routes. The evacuation routes include elevated sections and overpasses and column-supported structures that are not yet seismically upgraded and will not be until 2027 at the earliest and realistically later. The plan depends on roads. The earthquake acts on roads. Those are not separate problems. You know the ledger. The marble columns and their bivalve boreholes proving the ground here has drowned and resurfaced on a timescale of centuries. Monte Nuovo, still visible from the Pozzuoli waterfront, proving a long uplift can end in 8 days of fire, and proving it specifically at the end of a pattern whose first 2 beats look like the one the monitoring data is currently recording. The 1982-84 crisis. Within living memory, 16,000 earthquakes and 40,000 people relocated and a new town built to receive them, and the drift back that followed when the quiet came. And you know what the silence on the morning of May 21st was and was not. It was not suppression. It was not a coordinated decision by multiple independent agencies. to withhold information from a frightened population. It was the ordinary, messy, imperfect process of real-time seismology, taking the minutes it always takes to convert raw signals into a published result. It was the USGS publishing a wrong preliminary number, which is what transparency looks like, not what cover-up looks like. And it was a communication architecture that is not yet fast enough for the information environment it operates in. A gap that is real, that is fixable, and that the agencies responsible for it should treat as urgent. Each of those pieces of understanding is something the broadcast news audience, the person who saw a headline about a moderate earthquake in Italy and moved on, does not have. You have it now. The ground under Naples is still breathing. The Rione Terra GPS record is still running. The most recent available uplift rate figures show the caldera continuing to rise at something in the range of 15 millimetres per month, roughly half an inch, down from the peak rates of around 25 millimetres per month recorded in the autumn of 2025, but not zero, never zero, still accumulating, still loading the rock above it with the slow mechanical stress that produces earthquakes when it crosses a threshold. The coupling is still active. The caldera that produced its strongest earthquake of 2026 in May, from a direction that surprised the mental model, is still inflating. The next event in this sequence is already forming. This is what Campi Flegrei does, not since the current crisis began in the 1980s, not since the monitoring network was built, since before the Roman market was constructed on the promontory at Rione Terra, since before the columns were cut and raised that would later spend a millennium underwater and carry the proof of it in their stone. The caldera breathes. It has always breathed. The bradyseism is not an aberration. It is the permanent condition of this place, operating across timescales that dwarf the entire span of recorded Italian history, punctuated periodically. Not always, not inevitably, but periodically. By the kind of event that builds a mountain in 8 days. The story is not over. It has barely paused. Uplift rate at Rione Terra is going to appear in more INGV monitoring bulletins before this unrest phase is over. If you see that number climbing back toward 25 millimetres a month, that is the caldera telling you the coupling is tightening again. Listen for it.